She leaned forward, her
It's okay,
voice
I'm
soft
here.
but steady.
I
There's
know.
something you're not telling me. And in that instant I knew she could see straight through me, into the one secret I had never dared to say out loud. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater, and the gentle patter of rain against the tall window. I'd been here before, the same leather chair that creaked faintly whenever I shifted, the faint aroma of her peppermint tea drifting across the desk, the muted lamp glow that made her office feel less like a clinic and more like a refuge. Yet no matter how familiar the space was, sitting across from her always left me feeling strangely exposed, as though the walls carried every unspoken thought I tried to bury. She sat in her usual place, not behind the desk, but slightly to the side, angled toward me, the way she always did to soften the distance between us. She was in her early 40s, but there was something ageless in the way she carried herself, composed, confident, with a steadiness that made me feel both unsettled and safe. She wore a simple cardigan over a cream blouse, sleeves pushed to her elbows, her notepad resting lightly on her lap. Her pen tapped once, then stilled, as if even her smallest movements were measured. I tried to keep my words light. Small talk. Work. Routine. But she wasn't fooled. She never was. Her eyes lingered too long, studying me with a kind of patience that made silence unbearable. Finally, she leaned forward, resting her elbows gently on her knees. Her voice came low, warm, but firm enough that I couldn't pretend it wasn't meant to land exactly where it did. There's something you're not telling me. It wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation. And yet my chest tightened as if she'd pressed a hand against it. Because she was right. There was something I wasn't telling her, something I'd swallowed in every session before this one, disguising it with jokes, with vague answers, with carefully chosen words. I looked down at my hands, fingers laced too tightly together, the ridges of my knuckles turning pale. I could feel the weight of her gaze on me, steady and unrelenting, like sunlight warming the back of my neck. I wanted to answer. I wanted to let it out. But the words sat in my throat, heavy and impossible. The clock ticked on the wall, marking the silence between us. I thought I heard her shift, the soft fabric of her sleeve brushing against her chair. I dared a glance up, and there she was, still waiting, still quiet, her expression calm but touched with something else, something gentler. It wasn't pity. It was understanding. And that, more than anything, made it harder to keep the truth buried. I swallowed hard, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. My voice almost rose, almost cracked, but I caught it back and forced a shaky breath instead. She didn't rush me. She never did. She simply leaned back slightly, eyes never leaving mine, as if to say, "I'll be here when you're ready." And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I feared her seeing through me, or if I wanted her to. I forced a small laugh, trying to wave off the weight of her words. "You make it sound like I'm keeping some grand secret," I said, my voice lighter than I felt. Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, more like she recognized the tactic for what it was. She didn't push. She never did. That was the thing about her. She had a way of letting silence do the work. And silence in her office wasn't empty. It was charged, thick enough to make my own heartbeat sound loud in my ears. I leaned back in the leather chair, trying to look casual, but the creak gave me away. My fingers fiddled with the zipper of my jacket, anything to keep them busy. She sat still across from me, notepad resting on her lap, though I noticed she hadn't written a single word since her last sentence. Her pen hovered above the page, waiting, as though the next move belonged entirely to me. I tried again. I mentioned work. A new project. A joke about my lack of sleep. My words filled the air, but even as I said them, I knew she could hear the hollowness. She tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to make me feel stripped of pretense. She had this way of listening that wasn't passive, it was almost physical, like she was leaning into the spaces I tried to keep hidden. Finally, she said softly, "Deflection isn't dishonesty. But it isn't the truth either." The words sank in, heavier than I wanted to admit. I let out a slow breath and glanced at her, only to look away again. The rain had thickened outside, streaks sliding down the windowpane in restless patterns. I counted them, like a child stalling before confessing a mistake. Still, she waited. Her patience was unsettling. Most people would press, demand answers, or grow frustrated with my half-hearted attempts. But not her. She sat with her legs crossed neatly, hands folded over the notepad now, her cardigan sleeve brushing against her wrist each time she shifted slightly. The tiniest gestures drew my eyes without my meaning to, the way her thumb traced the edge of the pen, the quiet inhales she took before speaking again. "You don't have to tell me yet," she said, her voice calm, warm. "But you should know, I already hear what you're not saying." The room seemed smaller after that. My throat tightened, but not with fear. With recognition. Because she did hear it, in the pauses, in the nervous laugh, in the way my eyes refused to meet hers for too long. For a moment, I wanted to say it. Everything. Lay bare the truth I'd been circling around for weeks. But the words felt dangerous. Too final. Too revealing. So I stayed quiet, and she stayed steady. And in that fragile silence, I felt something I hadn't expected at all, the beginnings of relief. The silence pressed in until I couldn't take it anymore. My throat felt dry, but I forced the words out anyway. "It's not that I don't want to talk," I began, eyes fixed on the floor. It's complicated." She didn't move. Not even the faintest twitch of impatience. Her stillness was almost disarming. It was as if the whole room held its breath with me, waiting. I tried again, my voice lower this time. "I've been carrying something. Feelings, I guess. For someone." I heard the faint scratch of her pen against the notepad, then it stopped halfway through. When I looked up, she wasn't writing. She was watching me, eyes steady, soft, unflinching. I could almost feel them against my skin, urging me to go on. "It doesn't make sense," I muttered, shaking my head. "Not for someone my age." There was a pause. She leaned back in her chair, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. Her hands rested loosely on the notepad now, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper as though she needed to anchor herself. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "It's not someone my own age. It's someone older. Wiser. Someone who shouldn't even—" My voice faltered. The air thickened, and I felt my pulse quicken. I hadn't said her name. I hadn't said it was her. But I didn't need to. The truth hovered in the space between us, unspoken but undeniable. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but no words came. For a moment, all I heard was the steady rhythm of the rain and the faint ticking clock on the wall. Then she asked quietly, almost cautiously, "Older, how much older?" I hesitated, then managed a faint, almost self-conscious smile. "Old enough that people would have something to say about it. Old enough that I've been telling myself it's wrong just to feel this way." Her eyes softened, but her body betrayed her, the slight shift of her shoulders, the way her breath caught before she steadied it. For the first time, I saw something I hadn't expected, a flicker of vulnerability in her. She glanced down at the notepad as if to write, but her pen didn't move. Her hand lingered there instead, fingers tightening until the pen tilted, nearly slipping from her grasp. She caught it, exhaled slowly, and set it down with care. I couldn't read her expression. Professional. Calm. But beneath it, something else lived, a quiet recognition. I leaned back, heart pounding. I hadn't confessed the whole truth, but I had cracked the shell wide enough that the light was leaking through. And she had seen it. For the first time in weeks, I felt both terrified and strangely relieved. The room felt different after that. Like the air itself had shifted, carrying a weight I could no longer pretend wasn't there. I leaned back in the chair, trying to slow my breathing, but every second of silence only magnified the truth I hadn't fully spoken. She sat across from me, still and steady, though I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders. Her hands had moved from her notepad to her lap, folded neatly, as though writing anything now would have been too revealing. Her gaze stayed on me, not sharp, not invasive, but unwavering, as if she was trying to meet me halfway across the invisible line I'd drawn. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, careful, but it trembled ever so slightly at the edges. Is this about someone in your life right now? Her question hung in the air like smoke. I should have lied. I should have laughed it off, made another joke, shifted the focus like I always did. But the moment for that had passed. I hesitated, then nodded once. Yes. The words slipped out so quietly, I wasn't sure she'd even heard it. But her breath caught, just enough to notice, and she leaned back slowly in her chair. Her arms folded across her chest, not in coldness, but in a gesture that seemed protective, as though she needed to hold herself together. The silence stretched. I forced myself to look up, to meet her eyes, and instantly regretted it. Because in them, I saw more than professional composure. I saw recognition. I didn't dare say it outright. I didn't dare give the feeling a name. But she knew. She had to. And the worst, or maybe the best, part was that she didn't look away. We sat there, locked in a fragile standoff of glances and breaths, both of us too aware of what had passed between the lines. The sound of rain softened into a steady hush against the window, almost like it was trying to cover for us, to give us privacy for something neither of us could admit. Her lips pressed together, and she exhaled slowly through her nose, eyes flickering down to the floor for a moment before returning to me. That tiny pause, that tiny crack, said more than any words could have. I shifted in my chair, heat crawling up my neck. My hands clenched into fists against my knees, then loosened again, restless, like my body was caught between wanting to retreat and wanting to lean forward. I can't say who, I whispered finally, almost apologetically. She nodded once, but her eyes betrayed her calm. They searched mine, deep and unblinking, as if she already knew the answer. And in that quiet, I realized we were no longer speaking the same language we had before. The words had become secondary. What mattered was in the silence, in the unspoken understanding that sat between us like a fragile truth neither of us dared to touch. I thought she would move on. Redirect. Find some professional thread to pull that would unravel my confession into something safer, something clinical. That's what therapists were supposed to do. But instead, she stayed quiet, her arms still folded, her gaze softer now, as though she was weighing something within herself. The rain outside had slowed to a gentler rhythm, droplets sliding lazily down the glass. The clock ticked, but even its steady rhythm felt distant, drowned out by the thrum of my own pulse. Finally she spoke. Her voice was low, careful, and carried a hesitation I had never heard from her before. You know, you're not the only one holding something back. My breath caught. I straightened in my chair, searching her face for some clue, some sign that I had misheard. But her expression was unreadable, calm, measured, but with an edge of vulnerability that unsettled me. The words settled between us like a weight, heavier than any truth I had confessed. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but the look in her eyes stopped me. Not because it was cold, but because it wasn't. Her eyes carried something I couldn't quite name, a flicker of admission, of recognition, of the very thing I had been trying so hard not to say aloud. Her hands shifted, unfolding from her lap. She toyed with the pen again, turning it slowly between her fingers as though she needed something to anchor her. The movement was restless, uncharacteristic, almost fragile. I leaned forward, unable to stop myself. What do you mean? I asked softly. She shook her head, almost imperceptibly, as if chastising herself for saying too much. But the damage, or maybe the gift, had already been given. The boundary that had held us apart for so long had cracked. The silence afterward felt electric. My chest was tight, but not with fear. With possibility. With the dangerous awareness that what I had only imagined, what I had convinced myself was one-sided, might not be mine alone to carry. Her voice returned, steadier this time, though her eyes betrayed the calm. Sometimes we protect others by not saying everything we feel. It was the closest thing to a confession she could give me. And it was enough. The lamp on her desk cast a soft glow across the room, shadows deepening along the curve of her cheek. I noticed the way her jaw tightened before she relaxed it, the way she exhaled like she was letting go of something she hadn't meant to hold on to this long. I didn't move closer. I didn't say her name. But in that moment I knew she wasn't untouched by this. She wasn't immune. The boundary between us hadn't been erased. But it had been shaken. And once shaken, it could never feel quite the same again. Evening had crept in quietly, so much so that I hadn't noticed the light outside fading until her office was bathed in the muted gold of the desk lamp. Shadows stretched long across the carpet, softening the edges of everything, the shelves of books, the framed certificates, even her. It felt like the room itself was conspiring to draw us closer, to hide us inside its dimness. She hadn't moved much since her last words. Her shoulders remained lifted, just slightly tense, though she tried to appear composed. I sat forward in my chair now, elbows on my knees, head bowed, as if the weight of what was unspoken pressed me downward. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was low, cautious, and threaded with something I wasn't used to hearing from her: uncertainty. Sometimes, we see ourselves reflected in those we're meant to help. The words caught me off guard. They didn't sound like a clinical observation. They sounded personal, intimate, like an admission she hadn't rehearsed. I looked up, and for the first time, she didn't meet my gaze directly. Her eyes lingered on the floor, then traced along the edge of her notepad, as though grounding herself before daring to look at me again. When she finally did, there was no barrier left in them, no professional shield, only something raw. My throat tightened. The words rose before I could stop them. And sometimes, I hesitated, my voice trembling. Sometimes we feel more than we're allowed to say. Her breath caught. I saw it, the faint lift of her chest, the pause, the way her lips parted just slightly as if she wanted to respond but couldn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed. Alive. Dangerous. My hand rested on the arm of the chair, fingers drumming nervously against the fabric. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed hers, resting on her chair too, not far from mine. Just a few inches of space. Close enough that if either of us moved, even the slightest bit, the line would be crossed. Neither of us moved. The ache of almost was sharper than any touch could have been. I swallowed hard, my voice barely a whisper. You feel it too, don't you? She closed her eyes for the briefest moment, as though the weight of the question pressed too heavily. When she opened them, they shone with something unspoken, a truth that wanted to be freed but remained caged by duty, by boundaries, by the walls of this room. Her reply was quiet, steady, but tinged with sorrow. That's not something I can answer. And yet, she already had. The shadows deepened as the last of the daylight slipped away. The hum of the heater filled the silence. Our hands remained close, never touching, but my skin burned with the nearness. The confession hadn't been spoken aloud. But it had been made. The session had gone on longer than either of us realized. When she finally glanced at the clock on the wall, her expression shifted, not startled exactly, but heavy, as if time had been stolen from us and we'd only just noticed. She set her pen down gently, aligning it perfectly along the edge of her notepad. A ritual. A way of bringing control back into a moment that had nearly slipped beyond control. Then she drew in a steady breath and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, kind, composed, but carrying something else beneath it, something fragile. We can't continue like this, she said softly. The words landed in my chest like a weight, though they weren't unexpected. I knew it the moment I admitted what I felt. Maybe even before. Still, hearing them out loud made it real. I nodded slowly, eyes dropping to the floor. I understand. But I didn't. Not fully. Not in the way that would allow me to walk away without the ache that spread through my chest in that moment. She stood, smoothing the crease in her blouse, and walked to the small cabinet near her desk. She pulled out a file, mine, and held it delicately, as though it had become something heavier than paper. When she crossed back to me, she extended it with both hands. I rose to take it, and when I did, her fingers brushed mine. Just barely. Just enough. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a warmth spiraling through me, sharp in its tenderness. Her eyes lifted to mine, and for a heartbeat, we stood closer than we ever had, suspended in a fragile stillness. The scent of her perfume lingered between us, faint and familiar, the kind of detail I knew I'd carry with me long after this moment ended. I swallowed hard, my voice barely more than a whisper. You were right. I wasn't telling you everything. A faint smile touched her lips, not playful, not triumphant, but something quieter, something touched with sadness and fondness all at once. And now you have. Her words felt like both an ending and a gift. I stepped toward the door, the file clutched against my chest. The cool brass handle pressed into my palm as I hesitated, glancing back at her one last time. She stood in the warm lamplight, arms folded loosely now, her face calm, but her eyes said more than either of us would ever be allowed to. The soft click of the door closing behind me felt final, yet strangely gentle. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the fresh scent of rain-soaked pavement. I paused on the steps, drawing in a breath that felt heavier than it should. The ache in my chest lingered, but so did something else, a quiet hope, a recognition that what had passed between us was real, even if it could never be spoken again. I walked into the night, carrying both the weight of what we could not have, and the quiet, devastating comfort of knowing we had shared it, if only for a moment.